Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana. Welcome to the new year. Tonight's guest is Luther Weeks. Luther sometimes comes onto the show after election times with his CT Voters Count and Audit hats on, but tonight we're going to talk about the Secular Coalition for Connecticut. So thank you, Luther, for coming on. And it seems particularly appropriate that maybe some people are watching this rather than the president's speech on network television. I guess to start out with, can you talk a little bit about why the Secular Coalition for Connecticut and the Secular Coalition for America were started?
Yeah, and there's a lot of groups that represent free thinkers, atheists, agnostics, whatever you want to call them. I don't like the name infidel or heretic, but you know, whatever.
Some people use them.
Some people use that. Yeah, and so I'm thinking it was maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago, they got together and they said that, you know, they really needed a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. to watch what was going on, to represent their interests in Washington. And so they started out kind of slow and small, and now I think they have a staff of several people down in D.C. that, you know, organize, they talk to all the representatives and senators every year, especially when we got new ones there to represent our interests. They lobby on particular laws, and they also encourage states to do the same thing. So we have about 9 groups in Connecticut. They came together and they support the Secular Coalition for Connecticut, and so does the Secular Coalition for America.
Now, you said 10 or 12 years ago, that would probably have been the George W. Bush administration.
Yeah.
Was there a fear at that time that laws were becoming a little more oriented towards, you know, favoring not just all religion, but Christian religion and all religion, as opposed to our, in theory, longtime tradition of separation of church and state?
Sure, but you know, some of the worst laws were passed during the Clinton administration, so it's nothing new. What's new is them deciding that it would be a good idea to have our interest represented in Washington.
And as you suggested, it's a coalition. It isn't just all, you know, atheists and infidels. I mean, there are humanist groups, there are agnostic groups, there are people who are religious, actually, who believe that our government should be secular.
Sure, but I would argue that most atheists are humanists. And most
yes.
And although most humanists aren't, but most organized humanists are. You know, there's many religious people that I would argue are humanists as well.
Right.
Whether they, you know, whether they use that term or not, or whether they understand it as precisely as maybe we think of it.
Now, what's the state of Connecticut related to, like, how religious our population is?
Well, we're actually one of the least religious states in the country. A couple of years ago, I got some statistics from 2016. I think they changed a little bit. We were the 47th least religious states in the country. So that means there are 3 states with more people that were non-religious than we are. I think Vermont was one of them. I'm not sure what the other 2 is offhand. We may be 46 now, or you know, something like that. But we also, you got, you know, my numbers are also 40% and 8%. About 40% of the voters in Connecticut are non-religious.
Wow, that's pretty high.
That's pretty high. And about 8% of the voters, in the population as well, are either say they're atheist or agnostic. So if somebody says they're not religious, it could say, well, I was born Methodist, so you might, if you asked them, you might say I'm Methodist, but they haven't been in church in 10 years except for a funeral or something.
Yeah.
But people that say they're atheist or agnostic, they definitely have, you know, made a decision of which way they are. And 8%, people that are Jewish in Connecticut is, I think, about 2 or 3%. That's one of the highest in the nation.
Right.
And but that 8% outnumbers the Jewish, the Mormon, the Muslim, the Hindi in Connecticut and the United States. We outnumber those all combined together. But it doesn't seem that way very often. That we're treated like a significant minority, just like Catholics in Connecticut and Methodists and Episcopals, or whatever you want to pick, they're a significant minority. Whereas the Jewish population, the Muslim population, the Mormon population are not, they're important people, they're nice people, but they're not a significant minority.
And as one of the, I guess I sort of identify as Jewish, but definitely on the secular side of Judaism.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there are people within the secular movement who have Jewish heritage, but really are more, geared to being humanists.
They have official organizations of, people that the name doesn't quite get to me right now, but we have people in Connecticut and organizations, they meet, and in their Jewish heritage, they keep some of the traditions up, and they have their own Saturday or Sunday school. I think they actually do it on Sunday.
I went to Sunday school
but to train,
at times.
to have a community and have their children, so they're of Jewish heritage, and they're organized, but they're definitely not religious.
Yeah, I would probably qualify as very non-religious.
Right.
And certainly not a person who thinks that any religion should have a part in governmental institutions
Right.
or in the laws of our land. Judaism has an ethical system, but it's not the same as the Constitution's ethical system.
Right. And it bothers us when people have bring all the religious groups together, let's say, to have a service over what happened in Sandy Hook shortly after. If things are right, 8% of those children, 8% of their grieving family were atheists or agnostic. 40% of those children and teachers and their family were grieving were not religious. And nobody ever thinks to invite, somebody who's not religious to be part of that. And part of that, ceremony or sympathy or whatever else. And, that's bothersome to us. Just like when they do a veteran cemetery, they want to put up a cross as a veteran's memorial. There's just as many atheists in foxholes as elsewhere. The only place where there's a lower population of atheists in this country, as far as we know, is in prison.
Really?
Yes. Much lower percentage. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's maybe 0.5% of the prison population, whereas, if they were average, they'd be 8%, let alone the non-religious being 40% of our prisoners. I don't quite understand that. There may be pressure in prisons for people that are non-religious not to say that. I don't know.
That's really interesting. So, what would you say the current state in this country is towards people having the freedom to believe or to not believe? Is it getting better or worse?
In our country, we're certainly above average in the world. Okay, heretics get executed and their heads chopped off and things like that in Saudi Arabia and other countries down there around that area. That doesn't happen here. But and we have a constitution that's really not religious. There's the separation of church and state. Unfortunately, we live in a state that's actually a theocratic state. Connecticut's a theocratic state.
Wow.
The first sentence of our Constitution mentions God.
Unlike the U.S. Constitution.
Unlike the U.S. Constitution. Let me read it to you. The people of Connecticut, acknowledging with gratitude the good providence of God in having permitted them to enjoy a free government.
When was that written? That was.
Well, this was I think the Constitution of 1818. But this Constitution was,
Wow.
and in fact, I've been reading it over the last couple of days for multiple reasons. One was being on this show, but one had to do with some election stuff. And so this was rewritten in 1965. And about half the language here is amendments since 1965 to the Constitution. Not too many significant amendments as far as,
Yeah.
and you know, it has some great words in here that sound like separation of church and state. You know, many
Yeah.
things. The very second sentence talks about our liberties, rights, and privileges, which they have derived from our ancestors. So that's equivalent to we the
Yeah.
people almost. So, you know, it's contradictory. But it is a theocratic state. If you look through our Constitution, it says there will be no religious privilege of one religion over another. That's strange because if you look at state law, there's different laws for the Catholic Church and the Methodist Church. They're all incorporated differently in laws, so why do they even need laws for specific churches? You know, I could go on, but let me just say we have one bill in this year, and there's a couple we're probably going to support in the legislature.
Oh, yeah, I'd be interested in hearing, like, what kind of practical things we can do.
Okay, well, yeah, one of them we call the Oaths Bill. So, you know, when you go in and are a witness in court, or you become a notary, or, you know, a variety of other things, you take an oath in Connecticut. When you turn in petitions to your government, you take an oath that, you know, you didn't
Right,
cheat on the petitions or whatever else.
right.
And strangely, in Connecticut, it has 21 oaths specifically written in one law, which we call the Oaths Bill. And 15 of them are okay, what I call universal. So they start out with, I solemnly swear, or affirm, as the case may be, and they end at the end, so help me God, or under penalty of perjury. So I call those, that's a universal oath. So if you're really afraid of God, and God's going to get you if you lie in court or you turn in some
Right.
bad petitions or whatever,
Right.
then you know, I want you to, you know, feel the fear of God, you know, in that. On the other hand, if you're not religious, I might like you to know, and you might like people to know, and remind me that it's a penalty of perjury, because that's a little more scary to me, you know,
Sure,
and it's reassuring that even those religious people who may worry about hell also know that they're going to suffer a little sooner maybe with perjury.
Yeah, it seems a little more practical. And, you know, I'll tell you, religious Jews do not swear oaths. I remember from when I was a little kid being told that, you know, you're supposed to affirm, not swear, because they consider this taking, you know, swearing an oath is taking the Lord's name in vain.
Yeah, well, I bet many of them do. I
Yeah.
bet many of them do. They raise their hand and they go along with this. Yeah.
I've gone along with some of these, even though, well, the other piece of it, you know, with some oaths, like getting sworn into office, you know, you might have your hand on the Bible or
So,
whatever.
Yeah, let me just finish
Yeah.
one thing and I'll get to that. So 6 of those oaths are not like that. They start with, I solemnly swear, and they end with, so help me God. And they're written into law that way. And you have no alternative except to say, hey, wait a minute, I don't swear for whatever reason, and you got to say, I request the alternative oath. Okay, that doesn't happen often
Now,
because people don't want to
right.
out themselves. And, you know, so most of the oaths were fixed in 2002, and somehow they missed 6 of them.
Now, do those 6 have specific uses, or?
Oh, yes.
Because I think, you know, I talked to you, you know, as you know, and probably most of the viewers know by now, like, I try to observe, you know, one election audit each cycle.
Yeah.
And I don't always get to see the swearing in of
Right.
the people who are working the audit, but sometimes when I get there early, little before, I do see it. And this year, the town I was in did not use a universal oath.
Yeah.
They used a religious oath.
Yeah, and that's very common. However, making it up on the spot is very common too. So even though there's something in the law here that says what the oath is supposed to say, sometimes I've seen it made up on the spot. And sometimes they do it in a universal way, which I appreciate,
Yeah.
but sometimes it's the same old,
Right.
So help me God and all that stuff, but what's in the middle is not what the law says. So, what's interesting is I learned from reading the Constitution, and this was just a couple weeks ago, that part, is the law specifies how the legislators will be sworn in. And it gives, the Constitution says how the legislators will be sworn in. And
Oh.
it says, I solemnly swear or affirm, but at the end, it's only so help me God. So if
So
your
perjury's
Jewish
okay, I
friends,
guess.
if your Jewish friends
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
say I don't swear, well, then maybe they don't because they affirm, so help me God. And, so what's interesting is, in fact, the law contradicts the Constitution. Okay, but not the Constitution of the United States necessarily. Okay, our current law does, our law and our Constitution contradicts the law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. And in fact, as confirmed in 1961 by the U.S. Supreme Court.
And it didn't change things?
No. Well, this is the problem. You know how they have a law, they had the law of the Lovings.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I went to a documentary on it. So, the U.S.
Yeah.
Constitution, our Supreme Court ruled, at some point that, hey, they had the right to marry.
Right.
And screw the law in, I think it was North Carolina. But it was like 20, 30 years later that North Carolina changed its constitution. And I talked to people afterwards. I said, and they thought this was crazy. Why did it take so long? I said, well, Connecticut's had a law on its books even longer than that. Because it was before the Supreme Court ruled in the Loving case. We had a law in Connecticut that was ruled unconstitutional. And it's still in our state constitution. And there's a difference. When the Supreme Court rules that you can marry anyone you want, then you can marry anyone you want. And there's nothing else all they just do is ignore the Constitution. But when the Supreme Court says, in some other state, that you can't have somebody have to identify themselves
Yeah.
to swear, well, I'm sorry, when whoever's up there and swears in the governor and the state legislature tomorrow, the only way you can stop that is raise your hand, and then you're violating. So it's kind of a positive thing. The law is saying to the officials, you got to say this. They say that, but they're requiring me to violate the Constitution to get my constitutional, or they're violating the Constitution because I have to act to get my right. I have to act publicly to get my right.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So we'd like to change that. We don't see why, if we are on a jury, that was changed in 2002. When you're a witness in court, that was changed in 2002. Because I would argue to anyone that's religious, if it just so happens that one witness that your alibi, that you didn't kill somebody, happens to be non-religious, do you want the members of the jury to know that? Might they be prejudiced against that atheist? There are states, and there was a time when atheists weren't allowed to testify in any case in court.
Well, I was looking at that, I don't know, that quote from, the President Bush, the first President Bush, something about how I don't think atheists can be good citizens.
Yeah.
And that wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, he said what his legislative said is that they he didn't think they could be considered citizens.
Oh, not even good
Now,
citizens, not at
he
all.
never refuted that, so he never will, unless he comes
Yeah.
back and gets resurrected. But some of his friends said he never said it, and there's no documentation of that. Do you know that George Washington never swore on a Bible when he was sworn in as president? That's a myth.
Oh.
That's a myth started by the same person that started the myth about chopping down the cherry tree.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the first president that was sworn in holding on the Bible that people believe was the case was Chester A. Arthur. And it
Wow,
was
that's quite a bit down the road.
right, it's even farther down the road where there's actually documented proof. And I'm not sure when that was offhand, but it was sometime much after that, in the 1900s, which I keep saying this century. No, that was the last century.
Yeah. Well, that surprises me in a way. It makes no sense to me, actually, to get sworn into public office on a Bible. And, I served a term, on Board of Education, and I was sworn in. And I was given the choice of, having my hand on the Book of Ordinances.
Right.
And it's like, not that I worship the city ordinances, but it certainly made a lot more sense if I'm holding a city office that I am going to uphold the law of our city than the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a couple of years ago when I testified in this bill, one of our senators said he thought I was stamping on George Washington to propose this. And I unfortunately didn't realize and hadn't got the information that this was a big myth. So I'm not stopping on anybody. In fact, holding up the kind of tradition George Washington, some of the other founding fathers would say for it. And I just say, Connecticut had two great founding fathers, Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth. And we know too little about Oliver Ellsworth.
Yeah, I know nothing about Oliver Ellsworth.
He was the first senator from Connecticut. There were two senators in Connecticut. He was in the Constitutional Convention, Oliver Ellsworth. He was one of the first two senators in Connecticut. He rose to what they would say is the equivalent of the majority leader in the Senate. First one, I guess. And then he became the third Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, right before John Marshall.
Oh, wow.
And he was the third person nominated. The first two people were turned down. So it's not new to have people nominated and turned down. The first two people Washington nominated were turned down. Now, I'm just guessing that nominating a very popular U.S. senator was a good move on Washington's part to get somebody approved by the Senate, which has been true lately a couple of times, not in most recent times, but John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, and that kind of stuff, are good examples of that. And he actually, even though he was religious, he said, and it was quoted by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1961, he said essentially it's pretty dumb to have people swear to an oath to a God they don't believe in, because only a liar would do that. Somebody you would trust wouldn't do that. They'd refuse to do that.
And you talk about George Washington and the myth that he swore on a Bible. I mean, how many presidents down the road were we before there was a Pledge of Allegiance? And then, the under God was really just added, when I was in grade school.
Right. That was in God We Trust on our money, replacing out of many one.
Yeah, what year was that, the In God We Trust, or more or less?
I think it might have started earlier than that, but they were all on our coins and even making it a motto. I mean, we supposedly have two now, out of many one. It's hard for us to be a motto anymore. But it was in the 50s. I mean, I remember, being in school. My mother was religious, but she was telling me she thought this was a terrible idea because even though she was a Republican, she recognized the McCarthy era and Senator McCarthy for what he was.
Well, there is, a type of Republican, maybe fewer now than there have been in the past, who have been very adamant about preserving civil liberties.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I would think it's sort of a conservative view to want to conserve our personal liberties, but
right.
The party has gone a different path.
Yeah, and I think some people just aren't sensitive to the fact that there's a lot of non-religious people. So they're used to words like God being pervasive and having a meaning for everybody, even though for the religious that word has a very, very different meanings. Let me talk a little bit more about Connecticut here.
Yeah, please do.
We're not just about defending our own rights. We're in favor of, most atheists, agnostics, non-religious people, they're in favor of science and reason, okay? And part of that is, we have a state with some religious hospitals that trying to hide the fact that you don't own your own body, in their opinion, and the bishops know better than you do about your body. So, there's a bill in the state legislature to make statewide a law that was passed in Hartford, an ordinance passed in Hartford last year. And this was about a pregnancy counseling center that people claim, and I think it's true, they misled people to think they were a comprehensive pregnancy center, and they might have healthcare professionals there manning it. And so there was a law passed that says they got to let people know what kind of people are there, and whether they give all kinds of treatments or not for pregnancy, like example, abortion or birth control and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas, other pregnancy centers give all those options as potential options. And, we have a growing number of religious hospitals in the state of Connecticut. And if you look at their websites, they'll say comprehensive women's health care. And if you drill down in the right way, you'll find out that they don't do all of women's health care. There's procedures they don't do, and they don't list them. But the bishops know what's good for you, and they won't even tell you that those procedures exist. And men, don't be, don't be too complacent, because another thing they won't do is they will not follow all of your end-of-life directives if they think the owner of your body thinks differently than you do. And so, and they won't tell you. And that's the
Which
last
is actually the worst part of it. They don't, if you go into these hospitals and you don't know.
Right, you don't know. But anyway, we're hoping that bill passes and has hearings, because that will at least stop these, I would call them phony pregnancy centers. I mean, there are pregnancy centers, but people going into them need to have their eyes open as to what they're getting into and what they won't be offered. So that's, we're also in favor of what people call the right to die bill, so that you can make a choice to end your life sooner if you got a terminal illness and that kind of thing. We think that's a good thing. But we can move to Washington too, talk about some of the bills and some of the issues down in Washington if you want.
Sure, I'd be happy to, because I have no idea what's going on there.
Okay. So one thing we have is something called the Johnson Amendment. So every time the House or Senate tries to pass a bill, especially one popular with Democrats, and even a spending bill, they try to attach something that will get rid of the Johnson Amendment. And the Johnson Amendment is named after Senator Lyndon Johnson when he was in the Senate. And he put it on there and created it. And he said, in return for tax exemption, no nonprofit, including religious organizations, can lobby and do politicking. So you're not supposed to get up on front of the pews and say, you guys all go vote for Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or whoever you want. You can't do that. You just plain can't do that, or you'll lose your tax exemption. And so they keep trying to change that. Now, in addition to the non-religious being against it, and some religious groups being against that idea, a lot of the nonprofits are against that as well, because they don't want to be in that business. Right now, nonprofits and a lot of people, like,
Right.
if you get letters from some nonprofits, then they have two buckets that you can donate for. One is the nonprofit bucket, and the other is the lobbying bucket.
Right.
So if I donate to the Secular Coalition, I'm donating with taxable money, and it doesn't get tax exempt because they do lobbying.
I
If
know
I
that's
donate
tr-
to some other groups that are doing other things, then that's not the case because they're not lobbying. They're using it for other activities.
And some have both, like the ACLU.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, you
many
can.
many have
You have a
both.
choice. You can donate tax exempt to their education side, or non-tax exempt to their lobbying
Yeah,
side.
and I know like one group I belong to, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, they do a lot of lawsuits around the country to protect our rights and your rights too. That's taxable. When we donate money to them to do lawsuits, that's taxable. When we donate to them to do, other good works, then it's not taxable. So that, those are the kind of things that we have, and and I'm fine with churches lobbying and even promoting candidates as long as they give up their tax exempt status. That's,
Right.
I have nothing against that. They have the same rights as the ACLU or any
Right.
other organization. It just shouldn't be tax exempt. So they keep trying to tack that on, and so far, every time in the last 2 years, it's been defeated. The repeal of the Johnson Amendment has been defeated, but I'm sure they'll keep trying, and it may be a little harder for them in the next couple of years.
So what would be the effect if it does, go through this repeal?
Then churches and any group that was religious and any nonprofit, the LCLU wouldn't have to have those two funds. Okay, all these others. So it would be, when you make a campaign contribution directly to a candidate or a party or whatever, it's not tax
No.
exempt.
No, it's
So
very explicitly written.
Right,
That's
exactly. So that's but the Johnson Amendment would change, not for giving money to candidates, but giving money to the church or
Right.
ACLU or any organization like that. The Family Institute in Connecticut, for example. That would be. They could lobby and have it tax exempt. I don't think that's a reasonable thing. Another thing that is, of course, we'd like to reverse things like the Hobby Lobby decision. I think the decision itself was a bad decision, but there's laws that put in place that give religious exemptions to things like that should be removed. Okay, they're not supposed to have special laws for religion. Another one is, and you may not know this, but if you have that tax-deductible charity, okay, they all get audited, except the religious ones. The religious charities are not audited.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, they're exempt from an audit. Okay, so and there's cases going through the courts of nonprofit organizations that do good works but are not religious, not reporting there's information to the federal government. So like a report form, it isn't just an audit, it's just like a report form, an accounting that you're required to do. So the US government cracked down on them, which is what their intent was, so that they could bring it to court and say, we shouldn't have to do anything different than the religious groups do because it's unfair. If you're a minister, or maybe even a teacher in a religious school, and even some other employees, if the church pays you a housing allowance, then that's tax deductible to you.
Oh.
And that's a double deduction because your mortgage is tax deductible also to you. So if you're using that housing allowance to pay a mortgage, you got a double deduction there. So that's unfair that leaders of other nonprofits don't get a housing deduction, okay, for that kind of stuff. So those are some of the laws that we'd like to work on down in D.C. And you just have to be also looking at things like the Hobby Lobby decision and some other things that are going on. There's probably more laws that need to be passed to protect everyone, because a lot of times when people mean religion in this country, they mean mainstream Christian religion.
Right.
They don't really mean the Muslim religion or the Hindi or, some other. They don't mean that. People would be outraged, and you call it Sharia law if a Muslim group wanted the same privilege that Hobby Lobby has.
Yeah, and and I sometimes feel like there is a tendency to want to, like, counteract, the overt Christian displays by just having, wall-to-wall religious displays of every religion. And I personally have never liked seeing, like, Hanukkah menorahs in big public places, just because you feel left out because you don't have a Christmas tree. Because for one thing, Hanukkah is not a very major holiday, but it's like, have it in your house, not in the public square.
That's illegal in the public square unless the public square is open to other displays from other religions and non-religions. So
some non-religions, though, have been taking advantage of that at times. Or I saw something, I think, looking at the Secular Coalition's Facebook page, that there have been some towns in Connecticut where there have been non-religious displays.
There's many with non-religious displays. They've had some, I think it's in Vernon for years, but we had a big deal starting a couple of years ago down in Shelton. And this, people had to, I believe they took them to court, but or maybe not. Maybe they quit before they went to court to allow non-religious displays and have an equal playing field for all religions and non-religions in a park in Shelton. And what happens? This is so hard and proven Supreme Court doctrine. A lot of people try it, and usually the town lawyer says, look, you got to go, you got to do this. You got to either get rid of them all, or you got to let these guys in a fair way, or you're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in court, and you're going to end up paying for the other guy's lawyers too, and you lose, because it's a cut and dry case. And that happens not too often in Connecticut, but we got one in Texas where the governor's going to fight it out, and he's not going to win. He threw out atheist displays in a state place in Texas. He's not going to win that one. But I guess let me just say one other thing.
Sure.
So
we have time.
We have something called, we have two things. We have Darwin Day.
Okay, when is Darwin Day?
It's really easy to remember. It's February 12th.
Oh.
Because two great people from the, I want to say the right century, the 1800s. I'll just say to get it right. Were born on the same day. Okay, February 12th, 1809. So in the in England, there's Darwin was born. And another guy, we don't need to name his first name, was born in the United States. His name was Lincoln. So they're both born on the same day?
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I knew Lincoln was born that day, but I didn't know Darwin was.
No. So for several years in the U.S. House and Senate, there's been, for a long time in the House, and recently in the Senate as well, every year there's a Darwin Day resolution proposed. It's never passed, okay? Connecticut should be very proud because Jim Himes took over being the person proposing the bill when the other person that proposed it left the House. So for the last, 4 or 5 years, Jim Himes has put it in. And starting, I think, 3 years ago, for the very first time, and ever since, it's been introduced in the Senate by Senator Blumenthal.
Oh, wow.
So that's the credit to the activists in Connecticut in the Secular Coalition and the Coalition of Reason, and to those two people who are both religious, but for putting that in and celebrating Charles Darwin. We aren't saying this is Atheist Day, this is Charles Darwin Day. And I'm proud to say that last year, after he was a lame duck, Connecticut had its first Darwin Day proclamation from our governor, Mr. Malloy.
Wow.
And, we're hoping that, we get the same from our new governor, Lamont, who of all people should support it. And if you don't know, his uncle, Corliss, was a very famous atheist. He's written books about things and atheist funerals and that kind of stuff. Uncle Corliss has passed away for quite a while, but he's a very famous person. And in fact, Ned accepted an award from Harvard in his name a few years ago. But I don't know if we'll get to him in time. You know, it's not very much time between now and
Right.
February 12th, so I'm not sure we'll get to it this year. We also have in a national push for something we call a National Day of Reason. So we have the National Day of Prayer. So we'd like to declare that same day the National Day of Reason. And a little bit like those displays in
Yeah.
public parks, we just soon get rid of the National Day of Prayer, and then maybe
Right.
we won't care so much about the Day of Reason. We should have 365 days of reason.
We should. Well, you know, and that's kind of a flip side of the coin of where we are right now, not just, you know, some almost paranoid concern, you know, that Christians are persecuted. You know, how much do we hear last month about the war on Christmas? And there isn't a war on Christmas. Some people out there might be mad,
Yeah.
but there isn't really a war on
Oh,
Christmas.
there is. There is. There's a war in Syria. There's a war in
Oh.
Iraq. There's a war every Christmas. There's multiple.
Right, but the other piece of the religious side is that sometimes it goes along with the like anti-science, anti-reason. I don't know. We almost seem to be going through a phase of that in some sectors of our government. That is, it's almost like the religious hospitals that are not providing some of the medical care that has been refined, it medically is accepted. It's not
Scientifically accepted alternatives.
Yes.
Yes.
And so what do we do about, like, I don't know, trying to you know, get rid of the tendency to get rid of science and reason in, you know,
I guess
guiding us.
we have to keep saying that. That's a start. It's reason and science that got the United States to where we are today, for good and bad. Both sides, you know, science does some things that aren't good, some things that are very good, but reason can help us pick the right ones and handle them the right way. I mean, Europe is way ahead of us. Europe is, you know, I don't know, 10 or 20% religious these days. Europe is much more rational and reason, and more based on reason than we are right now. And I just, you know, let's hope the tide turns more the other way. People in the late 1800s figured we'd have no religion by now, and it looked like that might happen, but it went in the other direction. So, you know, religion will always be with us. I just would hope that it gets to be less of a factor, and reason and science become a bigger factor.
And there is some, you know, spiritual practice or religious organizations, some churches that are not anti-reason, but, and I don't worry about them.
Okay, yeah.
But the ones that are anti-science and anti-reason, I do worry about. And things like, you know, the Catholic hospitals,
Yeah.
I feel like I wouldn't want to go there.
And I think most Catholics don't know that. I would think a good portion of, you know, I think over 50% of Catholics use birth control, or did it at the right time. 50% of the women, obviously. And, you know, but I think a lot of them don't know. They know the church is against birth control, but they think because they don't enforce it on every Catholic, that they don't realize, I think, that they're actually undermining that in these hospitals. About 47% of the population in the country has no choice but a religious hospital.
Fortunately, we do have a few more choices in Connecticut, but a few years ago we had guests on the show from the Alliance to End Sexual Assault, and they were talking about the religious hospitals' lack of provision of care of rape victims.
Yeah.
And I think that there has been a compromise worked
Yes.
out,
Yeah.
that these hospitals in that case do have to let people know and provide alternatives. But
That-
I don't think that's been generalized.
Yeah, they have to provide referrals and get them to the alternative. I'd like to see that for other things, that, you know, that they provide the alternative, but we won't do it here and we refer you. And people say, oh, that's a huge burden. No, it isn't. Medical providers refer people all the time. You go to a general practitioner and you have cancer, they're going to send you to a cancer specialist. And you go to the cancer specialist, maybe at Hartford Hospital, and they're going to say, gee, for your case, you ought to go to Brigham and Women's up in Boston, or maybe you ought to go to Sloan Kettering, or you ought to go to New Haven, because that's where they do this particular type of cancer. So referring somebody is not, you know, you come into the ambulance at the nearest hospital and they say, wow, you got such a case here, we're going to take it and fly you to some other hospital because we can't take care of you here. Referring people and helping them get the treatment they need or want is not something strange in the medical field. It's not something out of left field. It's normal.
And that should be the case for things that are related to reproductive health, or as you mentioned, some of the end-of-life decisions.
And we're paying for most of the medical treatment in every hospital in the country. We're paying for it through federal money in one way or another. Medicare, Medicaid, and other subsidies we give. We're paying for that. So they aren't, you know, a religious thing, just doing religion there and, you know, operating a religious facility. They're also receiving lots of money from the government. And, you know, so that's another consideration in that. That says, you know, if the government gives you money to do something, the government certainly could have an interest or a stake in how you spend that.
Now, are there any states that are doing this stuff better than Connecticut?
Yeah, I think, well, Illinois for sure. I think Michigan as well. And what happened is some of these hospitals got some very bad publicity for almost killing women, making them bring a hopeless pregnancy to term, and the husband and wife get to see their little baby die in the first 2 hours of its life. They had no idea that, even though the doctors knew it right from the beginning. So there's some videos about that online, and so because of that, there was no objections and no problem. It was all, the law passed really quickly in those states. We're hoping that nothing like that happens in Connecticut. Nothing like that has happened, but that we get things straightened out before somebody has to suffer through that.
We'd rather pass the laws before someone has a tragedy.
Exactly.
Now, I think we have about 5 minutes left, and I saw there were secular voters' rights on the Facebook page, and I just wanted to read voters' values.
Values, please.
Yes, secular voters' values.
Values,
not
sure.
Yeah, freedom, inclusion, equality, and knowledge, and that just seemed like pretty sensible voter values.
Sure, freedom of religion, freedom from religion, inclusion of everybody, no matter what their religion or non-religion is. Let's see, knowledge, obviously, that's that reason. What was next to the last one?
And equality.
Equality, absolutely.
Now,
whether you're a woman, wherever you came from, whoever your parents were, you know, that's, you know, equality.
So in the last, 4 minutes or so, are there meetings of the Secular Coalition for Connecticut? If someone is watching this who has felt isolated in the past and wants to get together with a group of like-minded people, do you have events or get-togethers or meetings?
The Secular Coalition doesn't, but a related group called the Coalition of Reason occasionally does. But we have Hartford Area Humanists. You could look that up on Facebook. The Connecticut Valley Atheists. We have groups in Fairfield County that I think it's called the Fairfield County Free Thinkers. They have a monthly meeting at the Silver Star Diner. Everybody down there seems to meet in the Silver Star Diner. And then there's one of these, the non-religious Jewish.
I don't remember.
It's a congregation of secular Judaism. I think that's what it's called. You could look that up in Connecticut. So you could look those groups up. So those groups have meetings. There's the Yale Humanists. It isn't just for students at Yale, but especially people around Yale. They have non-religious equivalents to the Alcoholics Anonymous down there near Yale and stuff. So those are some of the groups you can connect up with, and
Yeah.
you know, see where they are. Visit a couple of them. See which ones you like.
And if someone wants to help push through some of this legislation that's being, being introduced in Connecticut or being, tried again in Connecticut, what can they say to their legislators? How should they be reaching
first
out?
of all, yeah. Well, we'll have an oaths bill up pretty soon, I think, and I'm asking every legislator and everybody that has a legislator, that knows one and gets to sit with them, to say, please co-sponsor this bill after it's up.
Okay, and that's expected probably fairly soon after the session starts.
Yeah, but it usually takes like a month or so because they have a big backlog of bills to analyze and put up. So, I'm going to make sure and talk to my senator. He's probably going to put bill in, but I got to talk to him, make sure he's all set with it to put it again this year. But it might take several weeks or a month before it actually appears because they've got a big backlog. There's a group of state employees that analyze bills and put them in maybe better language or worse language than they were submitted in. So
I would think that would be fairly uncontroversial.
you would think so, but not in this day and age. Not in this day and age. You got to remember that in Connecticut, we only have 2 legislators that are willing to say that they're non-religious. Only 2. In fact, one of them just got one of those jobs at the Capitol. So we only have one legislator that's willing to say
That's openly
that is non-religious. And by the way, we have more than that. Okay,
Sure.
there are more than that. Okay, just that they don't want that. They're a little worried about that stigma. And then most of these didn't mention religion while they were running for office, and most of the voters in Connecticut don't care, and nobody asked. Okay, but they don't want to come out and say, "Oh, I'm atheist," because they'll disappoint some of their voters. Some of them don't want their constituents to know that they belong to a particular union, or maybe that they were Jewish, or maybe that they're some other religion. It's no different with people that are non-religious. Just we maybe have more stigma than any of these others right now.
Maybe so. Well, thank you, Luther, and to everyone. You can check out some of these groups that are around Connecticut. It seems as though the oaths bill, at the very least, should be kind of a no-brainer. Next week, my guest is Charlie Schott, and he started a new kids program at All Souls, UU, and we might have someone with him from the Grace Racial Equity program there as well. So we'll see you next week. Thank you, Luther. It's always a pleasure, and good luck.
You're welcome.